Camilla, we are here in Parliament for a great day when the King opens the new session for the new government of the United Kingdom and says things like, "I pray that the blessing of Almighty God may rest upon your councils." It's King's Speech Day. It's the day that we actually find out, after the manifestos, after all the campaigning, after all the shouting, what is the government actually going to do.
And the other exciting thing is we get to see the lesser spotted Tories. They're back in the political jungle, bless them, reduced in numbers. How are they going to respond to this new legislative agenda by a Labour government for the first time in 15 years?
And we will have members of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party on this special edition of the Daily Tea. So welcome to it, the Daily Tea, with me, Kamal.
And me, Camilla Dominic.
So Camilla, we are here surrounded by road sweepers, helicopters.
Great conditions, isn't it, for recording a podcast this?
It is. We're standing on College Green. It is beautifully sunny, although the sun has just gone in, just for this opening bit. We have the Houses of Parliament behind us, where the King has come to open Parliament with all the new MPs coming.
We can see Big Ben just poking his head above the main chambers, which is a sight to behold always, to be honest.
Lots of horses, lots of pomp and ceremony. A few Republican protesters holding up banners saying
Spoil sports
for the day. But Camilla, your day started very, very early in what we like to call, and actually is, Central Lobby. That's at the heart of Parliament is the area where journalists and MPs often chat and gossip about what's coming up.
Let's look at the big themes first of all, Kamal, because we're going to speak to Penna, our resident sort of details man, about some of the other pieces of legislation. But just thematically, what was your impression about what has been put on offer to the electorate today?
It's going to be busy. 35 bills in comparison with 23 bills in the last year of Rishi Sunak's government. They've put an awful lot out there to be tested against. I think there are three big things for this government. They laid out this big manifesto, but on what they'll be tested on: immigration, and has the legislation they put forward on the border force controls, on the asylum returns, is that going to be enough? People will want to see the numbers of immigrants coming to the UK come down, and they'll want to see the asylum problem sorted. Second big thing, the NHS and social care actually hear very little. And I think they may struggle to show how they're going to change the NHS and improve social care without some big legislative moments. And then the third thing, and probably the biggest thing, the economy. Yes, there's some tweaking which we'll come on to about the office, what the role of the Office for Budget Responsibility is. But without growth, Keir Starmer doesn't have a policy on so many different things, because they are relying on growth to bring in new public financing for all the things they want to do. So those were the three big themes for me. And I think although they will have a honeymoon, this is a very ambitious list, but on immigration and on the economy, quite difficult to see will they get the results they need.
Is this maybe because, at his heart, despite the quite left-wing nature of his leadership pitch in 2020, Keir Starmer isn't a radical. He's just quite bland. And therefore this agenda, okay, there's ambition there, there's a lot of continuity, there's nothing too alarming in it. I mean, perhaps you can drill down into some of the reforms that Angela Rayner is wanting to introduce, particularly when it comes to minimum wage. I'd quite like to see how that is going to play out in practice, this idea that we must remove age restrictions on the minimum wage. Well, does that mean that my daughter, who's 15 and washing up glasses in the local pub, is going to be paid the same amount as the person who might be older and doing the same job? I don't know. And what's the actual effect on business going to be? I mean, you get these proposed laws and you look at them and you read through the theory and you think, oh yeah, well, okay, in principle that sounds like a good idea. It's really hard to then kind of map out what they'll all look like in practice.
For a while, the public will be a bit switched off from politics.
Yes.
As we've discussed, Camilla, it's over the next 6 months to a year that they'll need the data to improve on public services, whether that is the NHS, whether that's education, whether that's social care, whether that's transport. this is the start of that journey where, frankly, the simplicity of opposition changes into the complexity of government. Governing is really hard work. One thing I did really like, Keir Starmer said he wanted to see the end of the snake oil salespeople. He wanted to see the end of the idea that there are easy options and there are easy answers. The problem that opens up for him, that's a good message, I think, politically. The problem it opens up for him is that there aren't easy answers, and that's why so many governments ultimately fail.
The snake oil reference, I mean, I was thinking he was aiming that directly at Farage, presumably. Did you think that?
Yeah, and I think then, as you've said, maybe some of the right of the Conservative Party with some of these, what we discussed yesterday at length, the popular Conservative ideas around we just need to slash immigration or zero immigration, when you still got, falling birth rates, etc.
Yes.
Do those things really work?
So the big political message as well was sort of service, sensible government, restoring competence and therefore confidence in government. Dom Penna joins us now, political correspondent extraordinaire, author of the Politics newsletter, which you must subscribe to on the Telegraph website. Let's just talk about the overview here, Kamal. Let's talk about
picture.
The theme.
You were in there, Dom. What was your sense? What do you think Labour, Keir Starmer, our new Prime Minister, what do you think he wants the big takeaway to be?
I mean, so many of the bills that Starmer introduced today were very, very familiar from the general election campaign. There were obviously the confirmations that he would bring in housing reform, overhauling and ripping up a lot of planning protections, building on some greenbelt land by redefining it as grey belt to try to build 1.5 million homes. He will want certainly the left of his party to take heart from, for example, the new Equality Act, which will put race on an even keel with gender. And the other talking point on the equalities front was the ban on conversion therapy. Probably the most radical bill in there today, as familiar as it now is this introduction for the first time of 20% VAT on independent school fees. And again, this is another example of there were no surprises today, more Starmer saying, this is what I put in my manifesto, now here is how I plan to deliver it, whether people like it or not.
So we've got the actual nuts and bolts of the legislation. Just in terms of the message he was trying to convey, Kamal, it's very much, I'm sensible, I'm competent, I'm moderate and reasonable. I thought that line was interesting about beware the snake oil being sold by others. The others, I think he was referring to Nigel Farage, right, probably, and maybe some Tory righties. The economic sort of fiscal responsibility line, which Rachel Reeves is very much trying to push to capitalise on the idea that the public now thinks that Labour, and not the Conservatives, are the more economically responsible of the two parties. This idea of locking in and giving more power to the Office for Budget Responsibility, that is not going to be a popular thing among Tories who want a bit more sort of freedom. They're worried, aren't they, that the OBR is already setting budget policy rather than reacting to it. Is this a good idea or not?
I think the way that the Office for Budget Responsibility helps the government decide on what growth measures will work is a thing for discussion. What Rachel Reeves has done by strengthening the OBR is saying you can't have what is called a fiscal event without the Office for Budget Responsibility judging what the effects of it on the public finances are. And the reason for that is to stop another Liz Truss.
Yeah.
And I think that even Conservatives will agree that the markets need to be kept on side. If you don't have a judgment by the OBR at that moment of whatever a fiscal event is, then the markets will punish you with higher interest rates for your debt and therefore higher mortgage rates for the public, because if interest rates go up, they feed through ultimately to people's mortgages. So I think what was called the Budget Responsibility Bill is actually quite useful for calming the markets. What we've seen, Camilla, here, which I think has been unusual for a left-wing government, is that the markets have actually said that this government is less risky than the Conservative government after Liz Truss, and Rachel Reeves is trying to make sure that doesn't happen again. Okay,
so some continuity conservatism, Dom. So we've got the tobacco ban, that remains. What else has he kept from Rishi Sunak's administration?
So as well as the tobacco ban, which was the big flagship policy other than the Rwanda bill by the end of Rishi Sunak's premiership, he made a massive thing of announcing it at the annual Tory conference in Manchester back in October. And the other sort of main point of continuity is the football regulator. You saw Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer both appear at
We're just fighting We're just fighting another road sweeper just going by us.
That is an industrial-sized
That's a big one.
horse
There's a lot
manure
of
collector.
cleaning in Westminster.
To be fair, though, the
afternoon.
road is becoming immaculate as we speak. In front of us, we've got people out with shovels. We've got
Actually,
people with brooms.
just over there, we can see the
cavalrymen.
cavalry getting into their coach on their way home. They've been on their horses and now they're getting a coach home.
It's not right to see men in uniform boarding a standard coach, is it? We want them on horseback going back to their barracks.
It looks like an ambitious new Channel 4 show. Coach trip, but for the cavalry.
Dom, sorry, we were talking about continuity conservatism. We've covered tobacco, we've covered football regulation, we've got leasehold and freehold reform, we've got that ban on no-fault evictions that actually was very Michael Gove. I mean, he was the one who introduced that policy initially.
Absolutely, and where Sir Keir Starmer will hope that he is able to succeed where Michael Gove failed is that there are likely to be fewer NIMBY, not in my backyard MPs who ultimately massively watered down what Rishi Sunak and Michael Gove wanted to do on planning. What Starmer wants to do, 1.5 million homes in the Parliament. There is very little difference in terms of what Rishi Sunak and Michael Gove wanted to do and now what Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer want to do in terms of 1.5 million new homes. So as with many measures in this bill, it's as though Starmer has taken Sunak's homework, crossed out Rishi and written Keir. He has brought back so much that he hopes with this massive majority, with this supermajority in the Commons, he will be able to succeed in banning smoking for people under a certain age forever, in building these 1.5 million new homes where fundamentally backbench Tory resistance undid Rishi Sunak.
Where there are big differences is the red meat for what you might describe as the more traditional left. And you
Do
can
we
see,
call it red meat? Shouldn't we call it cucumber and lettuce? Or
No. We call it red meat. No, we call
quinoa
it
to the left.
We call it red meat, Camilla.
Okay.
So if you think of Angela Rayner, I don't believe is a hummus eater. She's not a limp cucumber
maybe
and
with
lettuce.
some Doritos on a Saturday night. Anyway, we digress.
You can see Angela Rayner, the deputy leader. If you look at the employment rights, they put in a lot more employment rights for getting rid of what they describe as exploitative zero-hour contracts. They've said that they want to have stronger paternity rights, sickness benefits, and then, of course, things like the renationalisation of the railways. That is something that Rishi Sunak and the government would not have countenanced, although actually there are two companies already in public ownership, TransPennine and LNER. Their performance has been so bad. What the government said in the notes to the King's speech is that 30% of all trains in 2023 and 2024, if not road sweepers, were actually late. And they are relying on the public believing that such was the poor performance of the railways ever since John Major privatised them in 1993, something that Margaret Thatcher never risks doing. She thought it was too politically difficult. He is going to go there. He is going to nationalise. So I think there's going to be the public are going to say yes at this stage, but if these services do not improve, what Keir Starmer has done, he's got rid of the fire guard. What the government used to be able to do is say, well, look at those private companies, they're not very good, you better sort it out. Now he's going to say, well, if the railways don't work, and he's put in place Great British Railways, which is a state-run, publicly owned business, suddenly all these problems land at his door.
That's a perennial problem, though, isn't it? Because for how long can the Labour government, Dom, start talking about the legacy they've inherited? I mean, we can have a couple of years of that, and then they're going to have to be judged on their own merits.
That's it, and that is why Starmer has committed to sort of very, very few massive flagship reforms, but where there are these flagship reforms like renationalising the railways, like Great British Energy, like the private school raid, they are very clear, very measurable, and all things that Starmer and co clearly think will work. However, like you say, Kamal, there is only so long that Starmer can rattle out lines about the previous government elected with about 33% of the popular vote, far more seats sort of in proportion to his votes in the Commons, Starmer is coming into Downing Street as an unpopular Prime Minister, and so much in this King's speech was sort of steady as she goes Starmerism. It really will come down to those big sort of 5 or 6 flagship reforms, which sort of in a year, in 2 years, once goodwill has run out, once the honeymoon is officially over and the nation is settling down with Starmer, what they make of him and what fundamentally they make of his government.
Should we just have a quick word about some of what I would call the kind of legislation that is in the public interest, in the human interest, and indeed sort of would have cross-party support? And that's first of all Martin's Law, which is named after Manchester Arena bombing victim Martin Hett, and that's calling for public venues to be more accountable, to be more prepared, and to prevent against terror attacks, because there was a sense that the Manchester Arena was found wanting that awful night. And also Hillsborough Law. Tell us about that, Dom.
So this is basically, again, taking on a measure that eventually the government just ran out of time to introduce, and that will place a new duty on public events, and basically it is aimed at making sure that those shocking scenes at Hillsborough when 97 people died can never happen again, through proper policing processes, through proper protections. And as you say, Camilla, it's good stuff, it is vital stuff, and basically cross-party. There is no one who can reasonably sort of in their right mind object to that.
We seem to have a brief lull in the manure collection process going on here in Westminster to bring Barry Gardiner, former Shadow Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, into the conversation. Barry?
Yeah, well, I think you need to regard these sweepers as a metaphor. You know, it's the Labour government sweeping all clean before it.
Oh, now.
You know, but
you're not likening to the Tory government to manure, surely, Barry?
You know that I would never be so discourteous, no matter what my private thoughts.
No, indeed.
You're looking resplendent today, Mr. Gardiner. Wonderful to have you here on College Green in the heart of London, just near Parliament. Going into the chamber and going back, you'll remember, of course, 1997, the Tony Blair government. What's it like going back to the government side of the chamber, not sitting on the opposition benches?
Well, look, you're right. It does feel very much reminiscent of 1997. A huge Labour majority, but a huge level of expectation going with it. The difference, of course, is that in 1997, the Treasury coffers were a bit fuller than they are now. It's going to be difficult to live up to that expectation, but I was really pleased to see that the King's speech has that level of ambition behind it. And if we come out and deliver quickly on that ambition, then I think people really will begin to say, yeah, this is what we voted for.
This is a vital point, Mr. Gardiner. How long does the government have for a honeymoon? How much goodwill is there from the public before they want to see results?
Yeah, you know, I don't think any of us knows that. I think it's very much going to be taste and see, because the election was called when it was, we're about to go into a summer recess, people are about to go away on holiday. Even if the government gets on and actually manages to bring in some bills before the end of July, let's face it, that's 10 days to do that, and I'm sure we will crack on and try and do that. There's then not going to be the time to put them through the bill committee before people have gone off on their summer recess. So I think we'll know, I suspect, by November, December time, whether the government has managed to do enough to persuade people, yep, they really mean business on the key points that we're interested in.
Is it definitely ambitious enough? Because the housing targets are the same as the Tories have had over the course of time, 300,000 a year, aiming for 1.5 million within this Parliament. Some of the legislation that's been announced, we're well used to now. It's been heavily pitch-rolled. We do understand about the renationalising of the railways and all the rest of it. And then that big offer to the youth of today, votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, isn't being legislated for.
Camilla, you should be dressed in green with a bubble hat on as the Grinch that stole Christmas. Look,
it's far too hot for Christmas metaphors now, Barry.
Look, I think it is ambitious. It's ambitious in the heartlands that we need to persuade, yes, it was worth voting Labour. Look at what's been said on leasehold and the reform in housing. Now, you say, well, it's the same targets as the government had, 300,000 new homes a year. Yeah, but we intend to deliver them, and as you well know, the previous government did not. So if we do deliver them, if we actually meet those targets, if we get out and transform the housing structure, so we do away with the old feudal system of leasehold, we bring in common hold, that's going to make a huge difference to so many people's lives. And also, of course, in the rented sector as well. So I think there's a lot that we can do in the housing domain that people are going to say, oh, thank goodness at last.
You're channeling your inner Michael Gove there, though, by talking about the feudal leasehold and freehold system.
Oh, no.
Conservative policy.
I was talking about it long before, and as you know, the original paper was in 1967 by Frank Dobson, who introduced a paper for the Labour Party at that time called An End to Feudalism. I championed it in the Blair government. We eventually got the Leasehold Reform Act in 2002, but it didn't go nearly far enough, and that was because the House of Lords in those days had many more Tory peers, and they said, we will block the rest of your legislation if you persist in this. So it's great, we are going to do it, we've now got to get on and show people that we meant it.
The big bill around strengthening the Office for Budget Responsibility. We have nationalisation, as Camilla says, we've got the new planning rules. There as well, you're going to need to have a partnership with business. How are you going to do that? If you don't get the economic growth that Rachel Reeves is claiming you are going to get, everything falls apart, doesn't it? Because that is being the absolute basis of your offer to voters. And so you're reliant on partnership with business, but you've also said there are going to be many more regulations. There are going to be many more bits of data that businesses are going to have to gather and publish. So you're putting constraints on how businesses operate at the same time as saying growth has to come.
Well, look, what was in the King's speech is actually about an industrial strategy and an industrial partnership with business, but stability being at the heart of the economy. I think it's right to give those additional powers to the Office of Budget Responsibility so that it has a pre-say before any tax changes that the government may wish are then announced, so that we really get an independent view here from the OBR. Now, we all know that OBR forecasts are simply that, they're forecasts, like the weather forecasts. Sometimes they're wrong, but it's important that they're based on the best evidence at the time, and they act as guiding lines for government. And then if we operate out with those parameters, it's absolutely right for the opposition at that stage to then say, well, hang on, you knew what the OBR had said, why are you acting outside that? So the previous government, as you know, didn't do that. What they did was they announced what they were going to do and then said to the OBR, now give us the reasons why it's all right to have done it. That is no way to run an economy. But your fundamental point about doing this in partnership with business, so we actually have a strategy for the economy and for growth, is absolutely critical.
We've got a little window of opportunity to ask you one last question. You've been in opposition for 14 years. You're now in government, Labour. What's your one piece of advice now to the Tories?
Be bold. Oh, to the Tories?
Yeah.
Helpful advice, I take it.
Yes, please.
You want me to be...
I want you to be...
This is the new atmosphere,
equanimous.
Mr. Gardiner. Your new
Yes,
Prime Minister has
okay.
said that he wants everyone to be working together.
Well, look, we will be working with different routes, I hope, to get to a common objective, and that is improving the lot of the British people. But I would say try and make sure that in opposition, what you do is by all means criticise where you believe that criticism is justified, but do it in a constructive way with alternatives. And I think one of the really interesting developments in Parliament over the past few years is the importance of the select committees.
Yes.
And their ability to be that constructive friend, constructive critic of government, whereby the select committee looks at something that may have gone wrong, but then puts forward a report that is constructive in trying to help the government achieve a better outcome. And I think any opposition that does that will be, in the best sense of the word, His Majesty's loyal opposition.
But you do know, Mr. Gardiner, being in opposition is a fairly miserable experience, given that you don't actually have that much influence over anything.
I've endured it for 14 years. I had the privilege of being in government. I had the privilege of being a minister under the Blair government and the Brown government. I know which I prefer. And being back on the government benches is just a huge relief, a huge privilege, but now we have to deliver.
Barry Gardiner, thank you so much
for
joining us on a sunny, if noisy, College Green. Thank you. George Freeman joins us now, former Minister of State at the Science and Technology Department. George, you're a lesser spotted being inside that House of Commons. You're reduced in number. What's it feel like to watch Labour present a legislative agenda and not the Conservatives after all these years?
Well, on the one hand, very humbling, quite humiliating, and a reminder that we didn't just lose this election, we were thrown out unceremoniously. Why? I think not largely because of policy failure, but because of our conduct in office. And the public came to conclude that the Conservative Party was busier and more interested in who should hold the crown than dealing with the really difficult problems that people faced. I happen to think we've left rather a golden economic legacy, but I think this was a conduct rejection election. So I welcome the emphasis that Keir Starmer has put on conduct, standards, integrity, just as Rishi did when he came in. We're clearly a shattered party. We're down to 120 of us. Some interesting new members, by the way, 25 odd, very interesting and experienced new people. But look, I think we're irrelevant for the next 6 months. My argument has been we need to recognise that, go into a dark room. I'd have a conference with no media. No one cares what we say or think at the moment.
What, Tory conference with no media?
Yep, I'd give free tickets to all the MPs who lost their seats and all our long-standing members, and have an honest conversation about where and when we lost public support, and then have a leadership contest. Having had a Clause 4 moment, I'd like to reconstitute the party, frame it around values, build the Nolan principles in. We have to show the public that we've got it, we've heard the message, and make ourselves fit for a 21st century in which there aren't tribal voters. People just want delivery, values, integrity, standards, and public service.
But Mr. Freeman, you are more than a shattered opposition. You are His Majesty's official opposition. You do have a role in Parliament, only with 121 MPs maybe, but you still have a role. When you go through the legislative proposals, where do you think the tensions will be, and what are you going to do to hold this government to account?
Yeah, so we are, but I wanted to start with humility before the opposition. I happen to think Rishi Sunak set a brilliant tone, both in his manner of his acknowledgement speech, but also in his first speeches in the House. We have a very experienced front bench who are more than capable of gently pointing out to His Majesty's government where we suspect they may struggle and where we don't think they've thought things through well enough. My own view, I think there are three things. There's a couple of very interesting and potentially dangerous bear traps. I think the votes at 16 and the talk of reforming the Lords. I mean, if they're serious about constitutional reform, as Tony Blair will tell them, that could soak up a vast amount of.
But the votes at 16 weren't actually in the speech.
No, but it was reference to constitutional reform. There's been a lot of talk of it, so we'll see. Secondly, I think the really big area they're going to struggle is on this very top-down statist approach on planning, on renationalising the railways. Clearly the system needs reform. I've been one of the loudest voices for reform, but I think it's very the man from Whitehall knows best. I don't hear much third way imagination here. So on rail, I've made the case for years we should have mutual rail companies, like an East Anglian railway company, integrate the track and the train and let season ticket holders have a share in it. A mutual, so the profit goes back into the system. So I think it's a very old-fashioned, rather Wilsonian approach. There'll be endless committees in Whitehall, earnest committees, very good people, but I think gradually they will realise the problem we realise, which is that earnest meetings in London make very little difference with towns that are really struggling, people reeling from the cost of living. So I think this top-downery, if they succeed, they will pour more box housing for commuters all around the green belts, all around the shires, locking in opposition for years.
Having said that, they have proposed more devolution, so that would give more power to regional governments as opposed to central government.
Metro mayors as well, Camilla, they've said.
And on housing, I mean, this is one of the failures, perhaps you could argue, not just of the Tory government but previous Labour government terms, that you didn't deliver enough housing.
No, and I accept that. I mean, we delivered far more than Labour did when they were last in office, but still not enough. And again, I've made the case that most counties could have a new town, a big new town, somewhere where you would actually improve the landscape. There are corners of most counties where you could easily put a beautiful new town and build the infrastructure. What we've got to get away from is this legal basis of big developers dumping housing estates, big commuter estates with no infrastructure, leading to flooding, pressure on public services. So I'm worried that, I mean, we'll have to wait and see, but I think that could boomerang very hard. And the really big one, I knocked on 25,000 doors. The three things people of all parties told me, outstandingly important three things. One, immigration. They want to know our borders are controlled, and Keir Starmer and his team are going to have to deal with it. And if not Rwanda, and if not what we were doing, they're going to have to. Maybe the European Union going to the right on immigration will help him, maybe. Secondly, NHS. And we've been pouring money into the NHS. The model's broken. It's not broken by Tory cuts. It's broken by a massive centralisation. Huge bureaucracies at DH, NHS England, with very little coming out on the ground. And if Wes Streeting is bold, I think only Labour can really reform the NHS. So that's one to watch, I think. And I wish him well, because if we could localise the NHS, integrate it with care, then he deserves all the cheers. And the last one is economic growth. And I just think they've confused house dumping with economic growth. And I'm not sure this Labour frontbench has got business, enterprise, innovation, small business in its blood, like the Blair government did. It feels a bit earnest, top-down, statist, and some things respond to that, but business needs to know that they've got a government that really backs enterprise and innovation.
George, one more question, please. You've been in government, you're now in opposition. What's your one piece of advice to Keir Starmer and his cabinet?
Great question. It would be this. Send a very clear message down through the system that ministers, prime ministerially appointed ministers, all ministers, not just cabinet ministers, drop the phrase junior ministers. There are secretaries of state, ministers of state and parliamentary undersecretaries of state. Ministers are sovereign. They have the prime minister's authority, and reassert cabinet collective responsibility, so that all ministers are batting on a team and they are all involved in having a voice. And I fear in the last few years, through the pandemic, through Tory chaos, through Brexit, we've become a rather presidential system in which ministers don't get enough support from their secretaries of state and the machine, the power machine in number 10. And if that doesn't happen, Keir will be the first to get frustrated, because government will be run by a cadre of unaccountable officials. Empower your ministers and send a strong signal of what the priority is. If you have a choice, always go this way. Mine would be responsibility. If you have a choice to give responsibility to people, go that way. But he needs to decide what it is and send it out and reward people who deliver.
George Freeman, a Conservative survivor. Well done speaking above the horse poop scoopers. Thank you so much for joining us on The Daily Tea.
Can I just say that you calling them Mr. Gardiner and Mr. Freeman, you're such a little teacher's pet. I now look like the rebel child. Why am I on first name terms with these people? It's because I once shared a cab back with Barry all the way from a question time somewhere miles away, and the cabbie dropped us both in London. Me and Barry had this, I felt like we were best mates at the end of it, so I'm now calling him Barry. George, I mean...
You had it, I suppose, as
You're
a journalist.
better than me. You're better than me.
As a journalist, it's always drilled into you, you're not their friend.
No, I'm not.
And you should always...
Look.
I mean, I call you Ms. Dominic.
well, yesterday you want me to call you Ahmedso.
Okay.
But you're so, like, you can take the man out for BBC, Kamal. I'm just going to observe that. I'm like the rebel child of this
Oh, and that's why we're
outfit.
such a good team.
That's true.
Yes.
Um,
What do you take? Let's go to Mr. Freeman and Mr. Gardiner.
Yes.
Interesting. I thought that George Freeman. I now sound ridiculous saying Mr. Freeman. But
No, it's
George
good,
Freeman.
it's
He said he wanted to say something about humility first
Yes.
before he talked about the King's speech. I thought that was really interesting, and that's the first time I've heard a proper analysis of what the Conservatives need to do. I love this idea of a clause 4 moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought it was quite intelligent for him to say that Tory party conference in the autumn cannot be some beauty pageant for a load of leadership candidates if they haven't worked out properly what went wrong. And we discussed this on a previous Daily Tea. You made the point, and it was quite right. Where are the intellectual conversations taking place about the future of conservatism in this country? At the moment, it's all about personality and not enough about policy and about actual substance over soundbite. Already, we've had Dom Penna, we've had other colleagues this week release little stories here and there. Priti Patel standing, Tom Tugendhat standing. We know Suella Braverman's definitely standing, although I think she might have imploded already. I don't think we should be having that conversation. When I was in the House of Commons, I bumped into our good friend David Davis. He's sort of as a grey hair. He's pulling his grey hair out, actually. Apparently there have been conversations with him and the likes of Ian Duncan Smith about having that kind of grandfatherly interim role to try and take things forward. All of the people with wisdom and experience in that Commons, on the Tory side, in the tea room, are saying, cool your jets, hold back, just can we please reconfigure and regroup? And then all of the eager beavers who are putting themselves before party, as is ever the case with these Tories, are trying to project their own individual status within the party rather than looking at it as a collective. It was ever thus, Kamal. These people, they never learn.
What is great is that I think that George Freeman will be trying to get some form of coalition amongst the 121 Conservative MPs for his approach. And as we have discussed, if you look at when Labour lost in 87, when Labour lost in 92, they had long policy reviews which made them ready for the next election, and that is, as we've discussed, what the Conservatives need to do. I was at a book launch event last night nearby here. It was for Torsten Bell. He was the former chief executive of the Resolution Foundation. He's written a book called Great Britain, How to Get Our Future Back. He won a seat for Labour, Swansea West, in the general election. And just like Barry Gardiner, there are a lot of Labour MPs there, and we have to remember they are all delighted. They're all still finding where they hang their coats. They don't know how Parliament works. I think the point you made about how long will the public give them time to run things. We had Barry Gardiner there saying how long the renting reforms have taken. 1967. That's the year I was born, and I'm really old. And he still said, we haven't done the work. And I think now the public are much more impatient for change. And I think there's all this delight now, the new MPs, you really feel it. What a great day for democracy the opening of Parliament is. But the public will be impatient. Barry Gardiner said 2 years. I think a year they're going to have to be seeing some real results. Yeah,
it's about delivering the policies and then the policies delivering. So it's no good coming up with a legislative agenda that doesn't move the dial much if people still feel, to quote Farage, that nothing really works. That actually, it's very difficult for the government though, because how do you witness that on the streets of Great Britain? That's probably why they're wanting to push devolution. I mean, sorry to be cynical about it, but on one hand, devolution, great, let's give power back to regional governments, take it away from central government. Do you know what else you can do when you devolve? Pass the buck, Kamal, and say, oh, it's not us, it's local authorities' fault that, for instance, the roads are in such a terrible state, or there isn't enough childcare provision in any local area, there aren't enough Sure Start centres if they're reintroduced and all the rest of it, So in that regard, I'm slightly cynical. However, I loved Gardiner's message on be critical but in a constructive way. My goodness me, we've lost a lot of that in public discourse over the course of the last 10 years, frankly. If you're going to criticise, don't just criticise for criticism's sake, and to be fair, Rishi Sunak said that in his speech today. Criticise with an alternative solution that you can work on together, because the public is absolutely sick to death of just politicking without any purpose at all.
just go back to the top of the Daily Tea, this special Daily Tea from Parliament. I think it will be economic growth, the NHS and immigration. I think if those three things show visible signs in the data of improvement, the government will be given more time by the public to fix the other stuff.
That and potholes.
Yes,